Welcome back. CyberSpace. Empirical training. You know what I mean? So they're like empirical training. Welcome back to the CyberSpace podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Empirical Training podcast. Welcome back to CyberSpace. I'm joined by Robbie of Empirical Training. I'm Josh of Empirical Training. And if you haven't heard us before, we are former colleagues, now friends, who met in our first cybersecurity role. And now our mission is to make sure that other people who want to get into cybersecurity are aware of the opportunities that are out there, are aware of where they need to go to kind of access this information. Because as we keep on saying, this information is almost so freely, readily available. All you need is a little nudge down the right path. So we have our school community, used to be in Discord, now we're in school. It's really been taking off. I think we surpassed the numbers of our Discord community already. Rob and the gang and everyone's been putting some really great course content together, so we can, as people have been asking, give them the kind of basics 101 of security analyst blue team roles, which is our focus. That's really exciting. That is coming soon, if not just been launched. So go check out the school community, Empirical Training School. You will find us on Google, or maybe you just joined us because you're kind of interested in security. You've seen us on TikTok or Instagram. You like some of the tips we're sharing about cybersecurity, about how to stay private in your life, and you want to know a little bit more about maybe hear our voice a little bit more, or maybe you want to know a little bit more about the kind of bigger topics that we want to we don't get time to tackle in the 20-60 seconds that we get on the social medias. So Rob, who have we got today?
Yeah, just off the back of that, we're democratizing education, and someone has stolen our tagline, but it's okay. Other people can democratize education. We're trying to lower that barrier to entry. Exactly. Like, give people access to that information and give it to them at an affordable price. And yeah, we're all former colleagues and friends and still work in the space. We're active in the cybersecurity industry. We've all got jobs, and we're the real deal. We're authorized, and it's I think that's really important when you're surfing through social media and you're flicking through those TikToks and Instagram reels. Do your research. Go and search through and do your due diligence around those creators. And you know, there's a lot of people out there that are giving you that information, but they might not actually be, you know, confirmed and have that knowledge in that certain area. But yeah, speaking of fellow content creators,
Robbie's getting a little bit shady there, but he is right though, because you know.
No, but it is important, isn't it?
If I didn't have my job, I wouldn't be learning the new stuff that I learn every single day on the job to be able to kind of inform these types of discussions. But yeah, you said a real trusted and valued creator. Who's that?
Yeah. Yeah, CyberCharlie. We had him on the last pod. He broke down his journey into the tech industry and into security and then into DevSecOps.
Check that out if you haven't.
Now he's going to go into a little bit more detail into DevSecOps, what it is, how would you go about breaking into this very niche industry. And he's a trusted content creator.
Verified.
That is verified by Empirical Training.
Hey guys, how are we doing?
Thanks. Yeah, well, thank you.
Fantastic.
Good. It's we just come off the back of Easter, so I think we're all fairly relaxed. And we record these a little bit ahead of time. I don't know if that spoils the magic. But yeah, Charlie, thanks so much for coming to join us again, because we really enjoyed listening to your journey. Like a lot of the guests we have on here, it's so interesting to hear people kind of carve out their own niches and find spaces that maybe are emerging, or that you think, hey, as a gap here, I could offer some value. And for you, that was DevSecOps, which is a relatively new term or new concept. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So DevSecOps is all about development security operations. And it's essentially the merger between development practices, security practices, and operational/DevOps practices. And as the kind of the tech market and the tech stacks of companies have changed, as in like we've gone more to the cloud, we do more automation for our development work and practices, there's more opportunities to integrate security as a part of that. And it's also largely come out of the fact that actually we want to shift security left. Now, what I mean by this is very often over the years, applications and products get built at companies, And then those engineers go to the security teams and go, we've just built this new app. Can you make it secure for me? And lots of security professionals have had that. DevSecOps is about shifting that completely and making sure that the moment teams talk about what they're building and how they're doing it, security is integrated right the way at the start. But in order to do that, you need the skills of how developers work and how DevOps practices work and how the cloud works, hence DevSecOps.
So DevOps, let's go back, rewind this before DevSecOps existed. What was DevOps focused on? What type of things are they building or creating?
Absolutely. So DevOps, quite similarly, has come out of the changing tech market, right? So these new terms and these new roles appear as we've migrated to the cloud. And as we then went from, so before we used to have very centralized cloud teams at companies, right? Which were very much like you'd have one or two people that would manage the cloud. And if engineers wanted to deploy resources into the cloud, they'd have to raise a ticket with the team and these experts would do it. But that's now changed. And actually that's been decentralized. And now everyday engineers, and we have DevOps engineers that help support those engineers, they now exist to make sure that everyone can deploy resources to the cloud and improve their development work practices. But DevOps as a principle is all about being agile, moving quicker. So what is my time from coming up with an idea to getting it into production? How can you speed that process up? And you do that through DevOps practices, using things like Kanban boards, Trello boards, using Jira, having user stories, and automating your testing as much as possible. You know, every company wants to get to the point of like Spotify and Netflix, where they get to deploy several times a day. Because if you deploy several times a day, you're providing more value and features to your customers, right? So DevOps is about getting that right and deploying and writing your code and pushing out new features and being competitive as quickly as possible. That's kind of where DevOps has come about.
And just cutting out the middleman was that initial kind of shift into get the people close to be able to deliver things. You talked about a lot of processes there, like a kind of the softer side of it, right? Because it's code in its command line, but also it's Kanban boards, there's productivity boards, moving your tile from to be completed, to be reviewed, stand-ups, right? Just kind of communicating. So why bother with all that? Why not just kind of let them, hey, here's your keyboard, you've got access to the cloud, fire things out there.
Well, loads of security problems with that, as you all know. But also the challenge with that is, well, how do I know what I need to put into the product? So for me, the furthest left you can kind of get shifted is at the requirements phase, right? So, okay, a product team or whatever comes up with an idea to build a new application. We need to speak to the security team and find out what the functional and non-functional requirements are from the security team, right? So if you get those integrated, having things like MFA, right? Make sure that auditing and logging on the app is correct. If you have those things really early on, then the team that builds it know they have to bring it in to a sprint at some point during their development phases. And then the app by its very nature gets secure by design naturally as it progresses, rather than we've already built it. It's really difficult to put MFA in place once you've already built the app, right? And you have to do migration, it's an absolute nightmare. So that shift left and getting it as early as possible is about that kind of requirements phase. And that requirements phase, that's not a technical thing to do, right? And the DevSecOps toolkit and the skills you need to do DevSecOps, it's not just about being able to, understand coding and that technical side. There's a lot around the processes side and the culture change at an organization to make sure they adopt those practices.
Gotcha. So am I thinking of this correctly, that DevOps was or is, because I guess it's not gone away, right? This is not, some people are just doing the DevOps stuff, is building things, releasing them, kind of the products, the features that you can write a statement about, that you can kind of push and say, hey, we added this new functionality. And maybe the problem with that was not having visibility into what kind of risks or what risks you might be opening up, maybe new attack surface that could be prodded or poked, and then having to, I don't know, tear it down and or say, hey, your work was pretty shoddy here. Let's go back and kind of rebuild it. And one, have to deal with a pretty annoyed DevOps engineer, but two, having a period of downtime to fill the thing, or maybe in three, having a period where it's vulnerable. Is that the issue with DevOps?
Yeah, exactly right. And the idea is, we actually want to take the idea of DevSecOps is the everyday engineer wants to focus on writing code, right? Building the best features. They shouldn't have to spend too much time fixing vulnerabilities or having to worry about security. So the idea of DevSecOps is, well, actually, we will come in and we'll automate the security behind the doors so that you'll just, when you write your code and you commit it to your GitHub repo, it might get blocked on a critical vulnerability. And then, you know, before you merge to main branch, you need to fix this vulnerability. But for the engineer, that's great, because they'd rather find it there and then and fix it there and then, rather than from a pen test finding when it's already live in production, because it doesn't slow them down and it's automated part of that. So DevSecOps and being a DevSecOps engineer is about putting those working practices and that tooling in place so that the business can deploy as much as they like and they improve that process as much as possible. But like I said earlier, because of how the technology's changed, so that kind of decentralization of cloud infrastructure, for example, right? So before, you'd have a centralized cloud team that would deploy resources in AWS. You would trust that those engineers that deployed those resources were cloud experts, for example. Okay. Now that we've created infrastructure as code, right? So a lot of organizations, they deploy their resources in the cloud via code rather than through the console. But that's introduced one of the biggest security misconfiguration issues we've seen in recent years in cybersecurity, because the everyday engineer that's an expert in Java, Python, writing their front-end application, all of a sudden they're writing Terraform and potentially blindly deploying resources in a production environment that they don't quite maybe understand. And there's a question, well, do they need to be an expert at AWS to do that, or an expert at security? So it's really important to recognize that, because a lot of the big breaches we've seen in the last few years are everyday engineers making S3 buckets public, right? You know, and making security groups open quad zero. Well, how do you protect the engineer so that they can write their code really quickly and deploy the resources and the infrastructure really quickly without needing to rely on an infra team to pick it up in a couple of weeks? They can deploy it that day. But how do we automate that? So, for example, we put in place infrastructure as code scanners as part of the pipeline. So actually, engineer will build their application, write their Terraform that deploys it into production. Then when they then push that PR, there'll be an infrastructure as code scan. You can practice this yourself. You can download a tool such as Trivy, for example. It will scan that engineer's Terraform code and it will say, hey, you've got an S3 bucket that's going to be made public here. This is a critical finding. I'm not allowing you to merge it to main branch until you've fixed and solved that. So they don't need to be an expert at AWS cloud security. They can instead rely on the tooling that we put in place to make their lives easier and to protect them. So that's an example of how you can actually shift security left from a big production issue happening and actually automating it as part of the pipeline. But as a DevSecOps engineer, you have to understand how those processes work. You have to understand what Terraform is, the AWS infrastructure is, and you put that tool in place. Once you put it in place, that massively protects the engineer from going, okay, well, I'm not that confident in Terraform, but I know my security team's put in the mechanisms in place to allow me to push my code quickly and test it.
You're creating a massive efficiency there, aren't you? Because the infrastructure as code, it's deploying various different resources en masse, specific to like their tailored whatever they want to achieve in that particular business, rather than like individually like spinning up, I don't know, like EC2 instances or opening up S3 buckets and things like that. And then whilst you're deploying that code, then you're integrating those scanning tools, as you mentioned, to catch all of those different vulnerabilities, like as and when they're actually deploying all of those resources, rather than like if they were manually creating them in the AWS user interface, then it might be, I don't know, X amount of days, weeks, months before they realize that there's some vulnerabilities that surround those resources. So
So yes, there's better outcomes because you are secure from the point where you're live. So you haven't got that kind of window of opportunity for the attacker. And it was almost, I was thinking of a kind of flashbacks to kind of school and being given drafts back and saying, go and improve this. You're like, nah, I don't want to, like, I've done it. You know, if you told me at the time to do that work better, I would have incorporated that feedback, but I'm really not going back and digging this up again. And Rob, another metaphor, I'm full of them today. You as a footballer, I was also thinking these devs, they're goal scorers, right? They're writing the sexy PR, public press release kind of features that really give value to the end user. They'll drive forward productivity. And then, Rob, you were a left back, right? Is that right? You probably if you had a winger who was super silky, super good at scoring goals, you'd work extra hard in defense running back to cover him so he could go be unleashed up front. Is that a way of thinking of DevOps and DevSecOps or
I like that.
Yeah, great analogy.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, the whole reason the business exists is to provide features to customers, right? It's not about cybersecurity, right? In a lot of companies. So actually, yeah, it's all about the more you can enable them. And always, DevSecOps engineers, and when I hire, it's all about that positive thinking and not saying no to engineering teams. And it's working with them, working with their timelines, but being business enabling, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is enable the business. We just do it from a security perspective.
And you guys, as the DevSecOps teams, are making people like, if I'm a SOC analyst, I help out the SOC in this company that I'm working for. You're helping the SOC analysts at that point, aren't you? Because if the infrastructure that sits inside an organization, if it's in the cloud, if that's nice and secure of all of their practices, all of their code they've got that exists in AWS or Azure or whatever it might be, if that's nice and super tight, then one would assume that there would be less security incidents. Exactly. It's not always going to be the case, but that
that's that left and right thing, right?
And it's also not only that, the incidents they get are going to be more accurate as well, because they've been
higher fidelity rather than those internal misuse, misconfigurations or
And another example would be, well, actually, you would create rules you can use a technology called Cloud Custodian. When engineers write their Terraform, it will again block them if they don't have the right tags. Okay, so a big problem in infrastructure and cloud is ownership of resources, right? Because you can quickly have loads of, what team owns this? And I'm sure as SOC analysts, you guys know, it can sometimes be really difficult to actually find the person that does it. Well, actually, in DevSecOps, what we do is we put the tooling in place to actually, they write their Terraform or they deploy their resource, they must put a tag of what their team name is. Because then if an alert relates to that resource and it goes to the SOC then straight away knows who we need to speak to, and it's all there in the tags. So that's another part of how you can shift that process left as well.
Well, that's
really useful. That's really useful.
Yeah, you actually and you can talk to imagine, because trying to find the right person to kind of action a security incident could be an absolute nightmare, and they all see you as wasting the time unless you unless you come armed with no, this is yours, or I can see this is what it is, and you're responsible for that. But you mentioned misconfigurations and vulnerabilities earlier, and I want to kind of maybe just go back a step and talk about those, because that's what you're looking to catch in that upstream, that by shifting it left, stopping there being a misconfiguration or a vulnerability. And they are not the most glamorous kind of things that sometimes you need a nod to some of them. S3 buckets being public sounds so obvious, so obvious that maybe they shouldn't be able to make them public by default, right? When AWS first came around, they fixed that now. It's not public by default anymore. But can you just give us an overview? What are you addressing? What are you stopping from becoming an issue?
Yeah, and exactly right. So when we think of DevSecOps, there's a few kind of types of vulnerabilities that we look at, and there's certain tools and practices we use to defend against them. So for example, we have the typical worst top 10 SQL injection, right? Take that one, for example, right? Well, actually, that's largely in the code the engineers write. Okay, so for that, we put in place a SAST scanner, static application security testing scanner. So what that's going to do, it's going to look at the code the engineers write and look to see if there's a lack of input validation or a SQL inject vulnerability. And again, you put that in the pipeline and you block it straight away. And that's an example of fixing a CWE vulnerability. Then we have the CVE software composition analysis type tools. Right. So this is where, well, actually, a lot of applications, engineers don't write all their code, right? They reference third-party libraries to build their applications. Okay. Now, these third-party libraries are full of out-of-date software that's not been up to date, etc., that could have vulnerabilities in. So what we do is we put in place software composition analysis scanners that scans all their dependencies and looks for vulnerabilities. And again, we scan those in the pipeline. If we find criticals or highs, we can block the pipeline and protect the engineer from committing that code to production, and therefore an attacker being able to exploit a vulnerability that's not in the code the engineer's written, but they've referenced it and they've used a third-party library. And then we have the infrastructure as code scanning, which, like you said, it's the code they actually deploy from an infrastructure perspective and making sure they don't deploy anything that they shouldn't do. Now, the introduction of Terraform has been great. We've decentralized teams. They don't have to rely on, weeks of engineers building the infrastructure. But one of the big problems we have found is that actually when you go through the console typically, and you go into either AWS, Azure, GCP, you get, and say if you deploy an S3 bucket or you build an EC2 instance, you get guided quite a lot. There's lots of boxes that say, be careful of this, watch out for this. When you deploy via Terraform, you don't get that. Right. So you can deploy an S3 bucket with just like 2 lines of Terraform code. But that's really dangerous because actually the engineers are not getting the hints and the advice about, well, actually, if you deploy this, be careful of this. So that's why it's so key that you provide the context through automatic tagging, as well as the infrastructure as code scanning is really, really key.
Yeah, not super glamorous, but I could really see the benefit of that now. I think this is probably why you're good at what you do. You're kind of communicating why we need to take these little extra steps because the benefits going to be huge. And I was just thinking there so Robbie and I used to work in a SOC together, and we used to work for a managed security provider. So they had thousands of customers that we are protecting at any one given time. You can imagine there are different levels of security maturity there, and also we don't always have the context of their kind of their build strategy, their cloud strategy. So when something's a misconfiguration, when they leave a door open, to kind of not get too technical, it's a legitimate avenue in, and we almost can't tell, or we can't really detect somebody kind of barging through there. It's a difference. If someone walks through your front door, you're not going to notice it, versus someone smashing through your window. That's much easier. You mentioned SQL injection. There's no good reason for someone to have SQL code in a web request, so we can detect that and analyze it. But somebody accessing an S3 bucket, which is a storage location from a location, maybe that was what they intended. We don't have that context, which is why it's incredibly difficult for a SOC perspective to work these types of alerts, and because we don't always have that context. And once they're kind of in with that legitimate avenue has allowed them in, they also then hide amongst the other legit looking activity, which is really difficult for us to get out. Normally that's sort of something that's only really caught in a threat hunting exercise, for example, rather than automated detections.
And you're exactly right in terms of the context and the threat hunting. Now, in DevSecOps, one of the big key things we do is we build out the secure software development lifecycle. So essentially, all those tools that I mentioned, they all happen at certain phases of an application idea to it going into production. Now, a big part of what those different steps are typically includes your requirements gathering phase, which is where you would put in, you can put in anti-attacker user stories from a DevSecOps perspective to get the engineers thinking about what they should do. You would then put in place, when they start developing and building the product, the SAST, IAC scanning, DAS scanning as well, and SCA scanning as part of that. But you'd also then do threat modeling. So like you said, and I know you guys have done lots of good content on like the cyber attack kill chain and things like that. In DevSecOps, what we do is we sit down, we put together a threat modeling workshop once the application idea is there, and we sit down with the team and we actually go through the Lockheed Martin cyber attack kill chain, and we say, right, and you sit there with the engineers, product teams, everyone that's involved in the application, and you get them thinking, right, these are the scenarios we've come up with. Right, and usually cover, use like MITRE ATT&CK and the other frameworks. These are scenarios we've come up with. You as the engineers, how would you attack this application? What things have we missed? And you start getting them to think, because they're the best ones to ask and come up with these ideas, right? Then they go, well, I've got a backdoor here, I've got a backdoor there, etc. And then what we typically do is we use that threat modeling to build out the pen test scope, and then you get a third party to either validate or confirm those areas you're worried about, so you're not wasting time in the pen test.
Yeah, I was just, that's a great segue, because I was going to ask about that. If you've got a company that's employing teams, DevSecOps teams like yourself, that are, catching all of those misconfigurations and those vulnerabilities in the code that's deploying those resources, what does that look like for pen testing companies? Does their scope change? Because like technically there are going to be less vulnerabilities that exist in that company internally in those cloud environments. Obviously they've got that scope for on-prem and like the end user kind of element, and then there's like internal versus external pen test and then social engineering engagements as well. But yeah, how do you see that changing?
Pen testing's changed a lot with this modern tech change, if you like. So before, I worked at companies where, a company would have everything on-prem. They'd have a big local area network as well, where engineers, had things locally or on file servers. And pen testing was about pen testing that part, pen testing the applications and the infrastructure the applications run on. Now, with the advent of cloud and how we do things now, the focus is more just on application pen testing, because actually reviewing the cloud infrastructure is more of a either cloud security posture management type tooling thing or security architecture review. So you do less of that in the pen test side, and it's more the pen tests now are more focused on the actual applications and what you can do in the apps themselves.
Interesting. So it's those the CVEs that you talked about later. Look for the vulnerabilities within the application or software, things that might not even be discovered or disclosed yet. Like it's not the case of running an old version. It's something. It's a 0 day.
Yeah,
make them earn their money, right? They can find a 0 day. Wow.
Exactly right. Yeah, and and that's why the SAS scanning is so important as well, because actually, if we notice a CWE, we really don't want one of those, right? Because that's, again, is that going to be picked up? You don't want to rely on the pen tests, because if you're a bit too close to either live, or you might even be live at that point. Yes, you definitely don't want those types of vulnerabilities going into production.
How much appetite is there right now in the UK and maybe the States for the implementation of DevSecOps teams? Is it increasing month to month and year on year?
There's still a massive education piece. A lot of people I speak to and companies don't understand it and aren't fully adopting it because they don't understand it. This is because cyber's changed so much with the tech stack. And like I said, if I was to create a new company tomorrow, would I buy a physical server and stick it in a room and put, you wouldn't, would you? You would look at the full cloud, you'd want development pipelines, et cetera. So therefore, the best way to secure those resources is starting with the quicker you implement DevSecOps, the less you won't have any tech debt, technically. And I've spoken to a lot of CTOs that have come to me and they said, Charlie, how do we secure ourselves? I say, the best way to do that is look at your tech stack and go, right, all new processes going forward, we're going to be serverless, right? We're going to use Lambdas, we're going to use serverless, even in AWS, when you think of the shared responsibility model, right? So even in AWS, you don't want to deploy EC2s anymore, even though it's in the cloud, because there's too much management, there's loads of things that can go wrong. We go all serverless and we shift everything left. Arguably, once you put those processes in place, you're going to have less tech debt, you're going to have less vulnerabilities found. And not only that, if we put in place development pipelines that force engineers to regularly run the pipelines, you're going to pick vulnerabilities up more sooner. For example, you can deploy container images, or teams could have images that haven't been redeployed through the pipeline for like a year, but those images are going to have loads of vulnerabilities in. So you want to make sure that they're constantly run through. So it's all about, for me, it's all very much about what is the tech stack of the organization. And actually, if the companies focus on getting their tech stacks right, so you don't have to worry about those managed the services that you have to kind of update and patch yourself, then you're already helping yourself. And for security and DevSecOps, it's a lot about working with the product teams and the actual people that make these decisions of the direction of tech. Because actually, if you have the impact there, you can change the future trajectory of the company. So many security teams spend their time focused on fixing tech debt that they never get to go in the right direction and actually solve the way they should be going forwards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. For the listener as well, somebody that's thinking about breaking into the industry, some people think, oh, I'm late to the party now, but look how new this specific niche role is in the cybersecurity industry, and there's only going to be more and more different types of roles that morph and that turn into something really, really great. And for the newcomer that's listening to this podcast, and please go back and listen to the previous one as well, there's a lot of value that was dropped in that pod. What would you say to a newbie that wants to break into the space, that might be feeling overwhelmed? We've been dropping some terms and some acronyms in the conversation already. What would you say to that person? How easy would you say it is to break in, and how would they do it?
So all the resources are free. You can learn it all online. It's just staying focused on the area you want to go into cybersecurity. If you want to go blue teaming, you stick with that and you learn those resources. If you want to go cloud, you learn those. If you want to go DevSecOps, you learn those. Pick an area to go in, because you can't do it all. I don't know one single person that's amazing at all those different areas either, right? So you pick an area you enjoy. But one of the things I do recommend doing is look online at job descriptions of the types of roles you like. Look to see what challenges get pulled out and the technology they mention in those job descriptions, and learn that, because that's the best way to stay up to date, because you're then following the challenges that companies have. And then you just focus your roadmap and your learning path on solving those problems, as opposed to starting backwards and going, well, what certs do I need? What degree? Instead, jump straight to what's the problems companies have that will convince them to hire me. Then you build out that plan.
Yeah, that's it.
don't get
Direct to the source. AJ was talking about that as well, wasn't he? Yeah. Yeah, direct to the source. Look at exactly what they face in terms of their problems, and then concentrate on that in the short term. You've also got a boot camp that you run that people can find via your link in your bio on your TikTok. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my culmination of being in I've been in cyber for nearly over 10 years now, and DevSecOps are approaching 8. I've always had the same problems of hiring the right people with the right skills. I've never been able to find it. And I've regularly had to upskill as well, really good, talented engineers. But you don't have to be an expert to go into this space. You can actually start, and more companies want junior DevSecOps engineers and people starting straight into DevSecOps already. So you can learn all this stuff for free. You can get the knowledge for free. My bootcamp is the culmination of, I will give you the guidance and actually show you what you need to learn. We build our own projects to put on our CVs, and I show you all the technology, and we get hands-on with the technology to learn end to end. And I mentor you and help you through what is actually a 6-month journey. And by the end of those 6 months, you'll be ready to apply for your first DevSecOps role.
And if any of you listening to this podcast, you'll hear just how good Charlie is at kind of connecting the why to doing things. You know, what is the purpose of studying a certain area? What is the purpose of a skill that you have when you're applying it in a business sense, which is, you know, music to the ears of hires. Like sometimes they write job applications, they don't really know what they want. They kind of wish for wish for the stars, and people turn up, and they're almost sometimes a bit intimidated by those type of job descriptions. But if you can connect and say, you know, here's why, the kind of benefits for each of these things that I'm doing, that's so important. In stakeholder management, communication are the one things that I think are really missing from a lot of the kind of certs that are out there. And that's something that I think it only really comes from more high touch mentorship types of programs like the one that you're pushing. And I want to, we're coming up towards the end of time, but I want to talk about a kind of bit of a interesting topic that we don't like to throw out AI too much and talk about it all the time. He says after he had 2 episodes on how defenders and attackers use AI, but I think this is a good opportunity because I saw a stat recently, and I think it's been around for a while, that 41% of all code on GitHub commits is written by AI. Now, I know there is some discussions to how did they work that out? You know, is that actually an accurate number? But I think regardless, the problem is definitely there. That AI is writing more and more code. How have you seen your role evolve from maybe pre this kind of generative AI LLM models being able to kind of write these pieces, and to now, and maybe even going forward? Are the areas you're thinking, we better put the brakes on this, or add a few more controls in if we want to really make sure we're not introducing a whole new area of misconfigurations?
Yes, there's a few things by it. One, if you're looking to get in this space and in DevSecOps, now's the best time, because you can use AI to generate a lot of your code and start from. I don't write Terraform blindly. You used to have to, or you used to have to go to GitHub repos to look at templates and then work from. You ask ChatGPT to write some Terraform to deploy an EC2 instance, it will do it. You know, I copy paste that in, and then I work backwards. You know, it might not always work straight away, but that means you don't need to learn these languages. And I don't think it's going to put engineers out of a role. It's going to mean engineers become more productive. But for getting into this space, now's a bit. On the bootcamp, for example, we build all our code using AI. That's how we start. I teach you don't need to learn the code end to end as a result. Now, and there's also the challenges as well, like you said, right? So a big thing with AI is the learning of the tooling, in the sense that, well, actually, engineers putting in their intellectual property or their proprietary code into different AI tools. What then happens with that information as well after that? I know a lot of senior leaders are really worried about those kind of practices. So really, it's an education piece to your engineers in making sure that they use AI tooling appropriately. They don't put anything in that tooling that they shouldn't do, and that it's just to help them create the tooling from a baseline and then build upon the code from that. But I think it's good, like I said, in terms of your learning journey, now's the best time without a doubt. You can do things that were just never possible before with AI, particularly if you don't have a tech background. It's a really fantastic tool.
Yeah, it can
Awesome.
really enhance all of the roles that exist in cybersecurity, and it's a mindset as well. Some people could look at even listen to this podcast and think, "Oh yeah, AI is coming in, the robots are going to replace all of the jobs," and that's just not the case. It's just going to
Yeah.
enhance our roles. It's just going to remove, like you said, like the monotonous work and speed up things, and then people like us can just concentrate on the interesting stuff.
And I think as long as you have all the right scanning steps and the pipeline automation from a DevSecOps perspective, and you're educating your teams as they go through the SDLC about how they use AI, etc., then it's perfectly safe, as long as you put all that in place. But you have to put that structure in place first to then allow that to easily update the teams.
Okay, so it's the same kind of processes, the DevSecOps principles. I don't need to change. They are applied to AI in the same way they're applied to people, because you don't really care where the code's coming from. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and what you would do is you would just you'd have your normal secure software development lifecycle, but when you do your threat modeling stage, you now include AI scenarios and how that works, and that educates teams and it helps them think about it before they commit to production. Sadly, there's no single fixed tool that exists that protects the code that engineers put into AI. That
Really?
doesn't. No, yeah. and so it is just an education piece, really. It's very difficult to stop what engineers do and what they put into AI tools. Then obviously there's the side that you guys mentioned in terms of attackers using AI to craft phishing emails and things from that side. But from a DevSecOps perspective, we're more concerned about what's the engineers doing with this code, and are the engineers blindly trusting the code that AI tools give them? That's another danger, right? If these AI tools tell you to do this with your Terraform infrastructure or this with your Python, whatever it is, are they questioning it, or are they going, yeah, of course that's right? They need to still challenge, right?
I guess whilst it's deployed, though, when it's deployed, you've got your catch nets. You'll see if it doesn't perform in the way that it's supposed to, or doesn't actually build out those resources on the front end. And then, like you said, you've got your scanning tools that would scan that code regardless anyway.
Yeah, so as part of DevSecOps, we don't just want our tooling in the shift left, you also have it after production, right? So for example, if you do software composition analysis scanning, yes, when the engineer puts together their container image and they raise their PRs, you scan it, but you will also typically have a passive or a periodic scanner that will scan production as well, because obviously something new could come up and they might not run the image back through the pipeline again. So yeah, you have to check. You need a kind of two-pronged approach.
Yeah, I've learned a lot in this podcast and the previous one as well. And just for the listeners, a lot of people think when you're in cybersecurity that when you're actually in a role, you know everything that there is to know about every single different job function that exists in a company. And we've all got our niche skills. Like we're SOC analysts, so we're triaging incidents and monitoring the customer's network and consolidating all of their log sources into a SIEM, and like the whole goal is to spot malicious activity and then again threat hunt across those log sources to find that activity that might have evaded those detection methods. And then with your role, like I've had a little bit of touch time with like Azure DevOps in terms of like pushing analytical rules through a pipeline to just create efficiency, rather than having to create an analytical rule and then create the same analytical rule in a different customer instance. We create it in GitHub, and then we create a repo, and then we push it and commit it to all of them, and it just creates an efficient way of handling those detection rules. And then you've got like the place that you can scan them as well to make sure that they actually work as well, which is really useful. But apart from that, I haven't really had any exposure to like DevOps or DevSecOps. So this has been really interesting for me.
No, thank you. No, I've enjoyed it.
This is what it's all about, though, right? It's collaboration at every step of the journey, right? Nobody has all the answers. That I kind of was a bit sarcastic when you said about silver bullet, but I've worked a bit in the kind of product messaging side, and there's a lot of people who want me to believe there is one, but also even as an individual, right? You don't have all the answers all the time. Even the most experienced absolute wizards of coding that I know that build security products. He likes to ask ChatGPT all the time what they think, and whenever he's talking to me, he says maybe we should talk to the computer, and we'll come back with this big pacemaker to just making sure we were kind of going the not missing something obvious. But yeah, the thing I've really learned from today is I'm going to make sure every people I talked about threat modeling now get their devs involved. I don't think everybody is. When you kind of said about that, I thought that was a great way to foster that security culture within the DevSec team in a kind of quite a fun way, quite a tabletop scenario. Hey, how can we break this? What would we do? So that's I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has listened as well, Charlie. And hopefully we've given you a little something also.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, gosh, yeah. I've not worked a SOC role either, so it's I've learned a lot. Very fascinating.
Yeah, awesome. This is amazing. Do you want to plug your social channels and maybe your website as well?
Yeah, so website is cyberagogi.com. There you can look at the boot camp, the content and what's covered, testimonials, etc., and how well our students have done on that. As well as my CyberCharlie TikTok, mainly on TikTok, but maybe in the future look at YouTube and Instagram.
We're gonna convince him to make a CyberCharlie Instagram.
Oh, it doesn't get as many views Instagram. What's the point?
I know, yeah.
I don't know, with this with that unoriginal content law that they've just introduced to TikTok, people might be venturing over into Instagram a little bit more nowadays. But then you never know. Instagram might change their regulations. We don't know what's in store. But
TikTok might get bought by somebody if the US have their way. I mean, let's not start a whole new podcast.
No. No, this has been amazing, man. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate having you on. I love what you guys are doing. Like, so many people get, like, whenever I get a comment and someone's like, what do we do about Blue Team? I'm like, just empiric. There you go. Those guys are the experts. They'll give you a journey. So
awesome. Thanks, man. Yeah, well, all things DevOps, everyone should check Charlie out, right? Because these are good concepts to understand and be aware of, even if it's not a career path you want to go down. Expose yourself to as much as possible. You never know when it might come in handy. I love to learn through osmosis, and social media is actually quite a nice way to do that. Mix it in with the cat memes and so on. It keeps you sane. So thank you very much, Charlie. CyberCharlie. Thank you, Robbie.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe Charlie might be jumping in to our school community and doing like a random webinar on DevSecOps. You never know. That'll be in the gold tier. That'll be in the paid tier.
Robbie always thinking ahead. The man with the big visions. That's what we need sometimes. No, thank you all. Thanks so much for listening. You can find us every week on wherever you have listened to this now. We are everywhere. We post this everywhere. Drop some messages in the comments for us, questions for Charlie. If there's enough demand, you want to find out more about some topics, I'm sure we could squeeze it into Charlie's tight schedule again and get him to depart some of his wisdom. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Charlie, so much for joining. Robbie, as always. I've been Josh. This has been Empirical Training, and you're listening to CyberSpace.
I think that's a wrap.